Okay, moving on here in chapter 5. So we're on slide number 6. We're talking about the 3 levels of narrative, okay? And so the first level is what they call, obviously, the top level. It's also called the meta-narrative, okay? This has to do with the universal plan of God, okay? Worked out through his creation, okay? And focusing primarily on God's people, okay? God's chosen people, okay? So the idea of the first level narrative, creation, okay? The creation of the world, the fall of man into sin, right? That didn't just affect God and man, although it did, but also horizontally it affected man and man to creation, right? It had a cosmic implications, okay? Creation, fall, and then redemption, right? The work of Jesus, and then restoration. Okay, working through his people to bring restoration to the earth, obviously spreading the gospel, obviously being salt and light and things of that nature, okay? So that's this idea of redemption history, or for those of you that can speak German, they call it Heilgeschichte, all right? It's the idea of the salvation story or salvation history worked out in the earth, okay? I'm actually modifying something on this slide there. Hey, I'm doing edits even as we're doing this. How cool is that? All right. So the second level of narrative is the story of God's redeeming a people for his name. Okay, so first level narrative is the general cosmic plan of God. Now you're kind of zeroing in here, okay? You're going from the bird's eye view, or better yet, the God's eye view, right? And now you're narrowing it down and you're zeroing in on the second level, that God redeeming a people for his name, okay? And so that's in the old covenant and, you know, this idea of redemption, okay? So they talk about here in the slide, our interest in this chapter is with the story of the first covenant, the story of the people of Israel, the call of Abraham, the establishment of an Abrahamic lineage through the patriarchs, the enslaving of the Israelites in Egypt, God's delivering them from bondage, God's making a covenant with them at Sinai, following by the conquest of the promised land of Canaan, the Israelites' first frequent sins and increasing disloyalty. Just check out the book of Judges if you want to know what I'm talking about and how bad it gets. God's patient protection of and pleading with them, and the ultimate destruction of northern Israel and of Judah, okay? Again, that's second level, okay, which is what we tend to think of when we think of historical narrative in the Old Testament, but that is called second level, okay? Then if you go to slide number 7, first level, okay, this is what they call all of the hundreds of individual narratives that make up the first 2 levels, okay? So now you're getting into the specific life of Joseph, or the specific life of David, or the specific life of Daniel, or Ruth, or pick your character, okay? And so what they're going to zero in on in the rest of this chapter is helping you to read and understand these first level narratives, okay? They're kind of bypassing the first level and the second level, okay? And they're focusing on the first. Again, first level, creation, fall, redemption, restoration, the meta-narrative. The second level is what they call Heilgeschichte, or salvation history. Again, God working through Israel and then up into the New Testament. And then again, the first level, these individual narratives, okay? So if you go to the next slide, that would be what? Slide number 8. They talk about the importance of understanding this hierarchy of narratives, okay? That helps you to understand and apply the Old Testament narrative. Again, if you zero in on that first level and you look at exclusively, let's just say, Joseph's life, and you forget about the fact that the main story in the Old Testament in the Bible is not about Joseph, but about God, you might misinterpret it or miss some things that are going on that are really, really important, okay? So thus, when Jesus taught that the scriptures testify about me in John 5:39, he was speaking of the ultimate top level of the narratives, in which his atonement was the central act, and the subjection of all creation to him is the climax of its plot, okay? In other words, when Jesus said the scriptures testify of me, it's not like you're going to find Jesus in every single word or every single chapter or every single sentence in the Old Testament. But that the idea of the meta-narrative is what he's talking about: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Okay. True, the individual passages, including narratives that are messianic or otherwise identified in the New Testament, are typological of Christ, and they're important parts of the Old Testament, but these constitute only a small part of the entire Old Testament revelation. Okay, you've got to realize that. Okay, if you look at every sentence or every little section of the Old Testament, and you're looking for a messianic context, okay, you're gonna misapply the Old Testament. Again, remember, we're talking about principles of hermeneutics, how to rightly interpret the scriptures. Okay, so if you go to slide number 9, it talks about what narratives are not. Okay. Number 1, Old Testament narratives are not allegories or stories filled with hidden meanings. Okay? While there might be aspects of narratives that are not easy to understand, you should always assume that they had meanings for their original hearers. Okay? They are not allegories. Okay? The account of Moses going up and down Mount Sinai in Exodus 19 through 34 is not an allegory of the descent and ascent of the soul to God. Okay? Some have taught that. Okay, Elijah's battle with the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18 is not an allegory of Jesus' triumph over evil spirits in the New Testament. The story of Abraham's securing a bride for Isaac in Genesis 24 is not an allegory about Christ, Isaac, securing a bride, the church, Rebecca, through the Holy Spirit. Okay, again, you're reading something into the Old Testament narrative that is not there. Okay, so the next slide, number 2, individual Old Testament narratives are not intended to teach moral lessons. Okay, that's not their primary purpose. The purpose of the various individual narratives is to tell what God did in the history of Israel, not to offer moral examples of right and wrong behavior. Okay? Very often you'll hear people say, what we can learn from this story is that we are not to do or to say this. Okay? But the problem with that is, unless the biblical narrative makes that point, on what grounds do we make it? Again, you're reading something into it. Again, the levels of narrative and what they're trying to do. That's not the primary purpose of the historical narrative, is to give us really great object lessons or give us great, very, moral lessons. Okay, we might rightly recognize from the story of Jacob and Esau that the negative results of parental favoritism, but that's not the primary purpose of the narrative. Okay? Rather, it serves to tell us how Abraham's family line was carried on through Jacob and Esau. It is one more illustration of God's not doing it right according to prevailing cultural norms in not choosing the firstborn to carry on the family line. In other words, the fact that favoritism is not a good thing, that is incidental to the main purpose of that story. Okay? In other words, if you were teaching this passage and you made parental favoritism the main point of your preaching, that is an inaccurate way of using the scriptures. Okay, could you use favoritism? Yeah, you could say, hey, listen, incidentally they're talking about this, but the main purpose is this. Okay, always try to help your people that you're teaching keep the main thing the main thing. Again, you can make distinctions, you can talk about favoritism, but that should not be the main point you're trying to make, okay? You can differentiate the two and help those that are listening to you to understand that. That's rightly dividing the word of truth, okay? Moving on to slide number 11, okay? Number 3, they talk about, even though the Old Testament narratives don't necessarily teach moral values directly, they often illustrate what is taught explicitly and categorically elsewhere. Okay, so in other words, later on in the book of Exodus, where the Ten Commandments are given, and then many aspects of the Torah or the law, the 613 aspects of the Old Testament Mosaic law are given in Exodus and Leviticus and not so much Numbers, some in Deuteronomy, of course. But the Old Testament narratives will illustrate many of these points that are made explicit in sections of the Exodus, in sections of Leviticus, in sections of Deuteronomy, okay? But that's not their main focus, okay? So they say this represents an implicit kind of teaching by illustrating the corresponding explicit teachings of Scripture. So the Old Testament narratives are trying to illustrate, okay, an explicit teaching elsewhere. Again, think Leviticus, think Deuteronomy. Okay, for example, in the narrative of David's adultery with Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11, you will not find any such statements as, in committing adultery, David did wrong. Okay, you're supposed to know that already. You're supposed to have read or at least understand Leviticus and what it talks about with regards to adultery. Okay, so that when you read the story of David and Bathsheba, you already get it, you already understand it, you already understand it's bad. Okay, they're not trying to say that. Okay, you are expected to know that adultery is wrong because it's taught explicitly already in the Ten Commandments. Again, Exodus 20:14 as well, that talks about that. Okay, so David already knew that. All right, and so go on to slide number 12 here. The narrative illustrates the harmful consequences of his adultery to the personal life of King David and his ability to rule. Okay, that seems fairly obvious. The narrative does not systematically teach about adultery and could not be used as the sole basis of such teaching. In other words, you've got to draw upon other scriptures to support this point. Again, if you were teaching it, you could use the example in 2 Samuel 11, but draw in other scriptures from the law sections of the Old Testament to underscore your point. But as one illustration of the effects, in other words, this is one illustration of the effects of adultery in a particular case, 2 Samuel 11, okay? It conveys a powerful message that imprints itself on the mind in a way that direct categorical teaching can't, okay? In other words, you're going to you might remember that, thou shalt not commit adultery, okay, the seventh commandment of the Ten Commandments. But I tell you, the story of David and Bathsheba, that illustrates something that you're going to capture. It captures your emotions, doesn't it? It captures your feelings. You can almost enter into that story in a way that's more powerful than just saying thou shalt not, okay? That's the purpose, or one of the purposes, of Old Testament narratives. Okay, I'm going to end right there.